Tax non-residence is a very tricky process, irrelevant of the country where you're trying to depart. And it is really important that you ensure that you are doing it properly. So today I'm going to be talking a bit more about tax non-residence in general. Hi, my name is Sadife. I have been with Nomad Capitalist for about 5 years now in the strategy department, where we help people diversify their options and accomplish their goals. Today, what I want to talk about is tax non-residence. Although this is not like an actual process which you can follow and it works for everybody, I want to talk about some examples and some misconceptions that a lot of people have when it comes to detaching yourself from a certain country tax-wise. So when you start the tax non-residence and you start to detach yourself from a certain country, either it being like Canada, Australia, the UK, New Zealand, whichever country that you are from, there are some general rules that you need to follow. But also you need to have realistic expectations as to what you can accomplish by simply just detaching yourself personally from that country. What this usually means is a lot of people think that just by moving outside of a country, you can actually not pay taxes there, which is not correct. There is a set of rules that you need to follow. Although they're not the same for everybody, there are some rules that need to be followed in order to depart. For example, if you just spend a certain amount of time in another country outside of your home country, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are not due taxes in your home country. Let's say, as an example, Canada. If you are Canadian and you spend 7 months outside of Canada, that doesn't mean that you're not due taxes in Canada. Canada has a set of rules that you need to go through in order to properly depart the tax system. And the days count is just one of them. So, for example, you need to ensure that you're cutting all of your ties. What that means is that usually your family needs to come with you. You need to close all bank accounts, all subscriptions. So if you're going to like a local gym, you need to cancel that subscription as well. You need to also most likely sell any property that you have in Canada, or less preferred, actually rent it out to a third party at arm's length. So if you do all of these steps, and on top of that, you limit your physical presence in Canada, you can usually detach from the tax system and be considered a tax non-resident. But again, this is a lengthy process. It's very tedious, so you need to ensure that you're doing it properly and it is properly documented. The same thing goes for Australia. You have some of these rules where you need to spend less time in Australia. You cannot have bank accounts, you cannot have property, your family needs to go with you. But also in Australia, for example, you have a rule that if you are continuously contributing to a superannuation or retirement account in Australia, you are considered a tax resident. So obviously you need to cut that tie as well. The UK is very similar to Canada, where you need to ensure that you're not spending too much time in the UK. Your family is coming with you. You do not have a place of abode. So for example, when you go back to the UK, you are going as a tourist, meaning you cannot have like a room or a house available to you that you can just stay, because that's usually a very significant tie to the country. So as you can see, a lot of countries have similar rules. So you have time spent there and primary and secondary ties. Usually primary ties are where your family is located and if you have a place available to you. The secondary ties are the smaller ones, like bank accounts, subscriptions, and like, for example, airplane hangars, something like that. So as you can see, if you want to go through the tax non-residency process, irrelevant of the country, you need to adjust yourself based on that country's requirements, even though they're always very subjective and they're on case-by-case basis. But again, there are a lot of misconceptions around tax non-residency, even apart from just the days count or spending time in another country. So there, like some other misconceptions are that if you have a property available to you, that's usually not a significant tie, which I disagree. It's actually a very significant tie. It is very important to actually not have a place available to you. So if you have a property, you need to sell it, or less preferably, again, rent it out. What's important to note is that a property available to you is not always just your own property. It can actually be a room at your parents' house or a room at a different family member's house. So you need to ensure that there's no such ties, and then when you're actually going back to your home country, you are spending time either at like an Airbnb or a hotel, which ensures that you're actually a tourist. You know, you have taken this move as something definitive and not as kind of a stepping stone. And that brings me to my next misconception, which is a lot of people think that you can only become a tax non-resident for a certain amount of years and then, go back and reestablish those ties. What I feel like is very important to do when you are becoming a tax non-resident is making sure that you are showing to the local tax authorities that move is definitive, that you've decided that you're moving away, you're no longer going to spend time in your home country. Obviously, that doesn't mean that you can never go back. You can go back in the meantime as a tourist, or you can reestablish those ties later on, but that shouldn't be immediately after you're departing. So I would say at least like 5-6 years, depending on the country that you're departing from, it is preferable to remain as a tax non-resident. If you, for example, depart this year and then go back to your home country in like 2 or 3 years, there is a risk that the local tax authorities will look at that departure as not a tax non-residence process, but as a extended holiday, essentially. So what that means is that they can go back and tax you retroactively. Again, this is just general advice, and all of these rules are better to be discussed with an actual CPA or a tax advisor, because each situation is different. Another misconception and a very common thing that people do when detaching themselves from their home country tax-wise is they maintain all of their bank accounts. Now, usually, honestly, a bank account is the smallest issue if you've cut all of the other ties, but it's important that, for example, in most cases, you do not have any credit cards or you do not use those bank accounts constantly. Apart from banking, I would say one of the most common misconceptions is what is taxable and what is not taxable when you are a tax non-resident of a certain country. Just because you're departing, you've become a tax non-resident, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be any tax applicable to you from that country. So for example, if you're Canadian and you have become a Canadian tax non-resident, that doesn't mean that you're not going to pay tax in Canada still for certain types of income. That is usually Canadian sourced income. This is the case for every country. So if you have Canadian sourced income, but you're a Canadian tax non-resident, you're still going to pay tax on that Canadian sourced income in Canada. The same thing is for Australia. If you are a Australian citizen, but you're not a tax resident, but you do have Australian sourced income, you're going to pay tax on that Australian sourced income in Australia. Same thing goes for New Zealand, the UK, Ireland, and the majority of the other countries. So locally sourced income is always taxable where it's sourced, irrelevant of where you are a tax resident of. So as you can see, the tax non-residency process is very tedious. There are a lot of details involved, and each situation is different. So what works for you might not work for another person, which is why it's very important to consult with a professional and to have the whole process documented in order for you to have proof. Even, if the tax authorities come back and ask questions, you have the documentation to provide them proof that you did everything correctly. If you want to learn more about, different tax non-residency processes or just different tax systems in general, you can check out some of our other videos. And if you want to work with us and you want to learn how this process would work for you personally, you can always contact us. So you can go to our website and apply to become a client. With that being said, if you have any questions, you can always leave them down below. And thank you so much for watching, and make sure to check the rest of our videos in our channel.